I want to share with you a process where you can verify an existing data set with date character variables and check to see if it's valid. To do that, you just select the data set itself, which I already did here. So if I were to reselect it, I can select from any data set that I have access to, and then select an identification variable, an ID var, which in this case I'm going to select the subject ID. So if I were to tap on run, it would actually execute SAS macro and then return the results in the form of an HTML file. So I'll go ahead and pinch and zoom in here. As you can see, it found two different character date variables. There's the AE end dates and start date, and if you look at the findings, this is just an example, but it found one case where there was a partial date, so that could potentially be a problem. And then if you go over to the right, it found 10 cases where the actual dates are missing. So if you were to tap on the 10 here, it will link down to the 10 findings. In this case, it lists next to the identification variable, which we chose as subject ID. So you can see for each of these subject IDs that the corresponding date variable is missing. If we were to go back to that listing and tap on the 1 for the partial dates, you will see that for this particular subject ID, there is a date that is partial, meaning it's, in this case, is maybe missing a day. It just has the month and the year. So these are things that will allow you to verify your date variables. If I were to go back and change my selection, for example, for the ID variable, instead of subject ID, I'm going to choose a different variable. How about the AE term itself, which is the adverse event term? And in that case, I'm going to rerun the report with the selection of AE term instead of the unique subject ID as the identification variable. So if I zoom into that exact same report, I can see here that these are the adverse event terms corresponding to the the rows that were missing, and likewise, if I were to go down here, this is the corresponding adverse event term that had that partial date. So this is in essence a good check for your character dates, commonly used for CDISC date variables. And you can also look at the original macro call. This is actually a SAS macro that was allows you to select a dataset and an ID variable, and then from this you can see what kinds of tests it does. Essentially, it verifies the various different kinds of date formats that you can specify, and then if you were to call the macro in a traditional way, you can type in the code, but in our case we are doing it through the iPhone, so you don't have to generate any code. If you go back to the very beginning here, these were our selection criterias, and it actually was part of a series of macros here. So if I were to go back to the very beginning from my desktop or iPhone screen, I can then select on the BI Flash application, which I can then navigate to this the date test, so which is a macro that I can go into. So if I go back to the library, in this example is the SciData library, and I select on the date test, which is what I was running before, I can then select the specific library that contains my example data sets, and then I selected the AE earlier, I can select another data set. So you can see how the selection of these parameters are facilitated through the iPhone, and then when you tap on the run, you can get your resulting report identifying potential problems with your character date fields.